My uncle was 71 years old when he called me on a Tuesday morning in February and said, "I need you to come to the house. Don't bring Wendy. Just you." I hadn't heard that tone in his voice since the night my aunt passed. Something clipped, careful, like he was measuring every word before it left his mouth. I told him I'd be there by noon. The drive from Moncton to Shediac takes about 25 minutes on a clear day. That morning there was freezing rain coming down sideways off the Northumberland Strait, and the Trans-Canada was a sheet of gray slush that nobody had gotten around to salting properly. I passed 2 cars in the ditch before I even hit the Shediac exit. I kept both hands on the wheel and tried not to think too hard about what he might want to tell me that he couldn't say over the phone. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, had lived in that house for 38 years. He and my aunt had bought it when their youngest was still in diapers. It was a 2-story Cape Cod with white clapboard siding and green shutters that he repainted every 3 summers without fail. The kind of house that looked like it had always been there and always would be. After my aunt died 6 years ago, he stayed on by himself. He said the house was paid for and he knew where everything was. He didn't need anyone to fuss over him. He met me at the door before I even knocked. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's on." He looked fine. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd been half expecting him to look sick or scared or like something had happened, but he just looked like himself. A little thinner than last Thanksgiving, maybe, but his eyes were clear, and he was moving around the kitchen without any trouble. We sat at the table with our coffees, and he didn't say anything for a minute. He just looked at the window. The freezing rain was still coming down, and you could hear it ticking against the glass. "I need you to film something in the basement," he said finally. "Sure," I said. "What is it?" "I'll show you. The basement stairs in that house are steep and narrow." He took them slowly, one hand on the railing. I followed behind him and pulled the chain on the overhead bulb at the bottom. The basement was the same as it had always been. Concrete floor, exposed joists, the old oil furnace in the corner that he'd never gotten around to replacing, a chest freezer along the south wall, and shelves his father had built in the 70s out of 2x4s and plywood. Garden tools, paint cans, Christmas decorations, and cardboard boxes with the year written on the side in black marker. The smell of cold concrete and old motor oil. He walked to the far end of the basement, past the furnace, to a spot behind the chest freezer where he'd always stored his fishing equipment, rods, tackle boxes, a bait casting reel he'd had since before I was born. He reached behind the chest freezer and pulled it away from the wall about a foot. Not much. Just enough. "Look at that," he said. I looked. Behind the freezer, low on the wall, was a section of drywall panel maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. It wasn't original to the house. You could tell because the paint was slightly different. Not much, but enough that you'd notice if you knew what you were looking at. And along the edges, the seam was too clean. Someone had cut it deliberately and then put it back in place. "How long has that been there?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "I found it last week when I was moving the freezer to clean behind it. Your aunt always got after me to do it and I never did. Figured I'd do it now." He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small flathead screwdriver. He pressed the tip into the seam at the top right corner and pried gently. The panel came free on the first try. There were no screws. It just lifted out. Behind it was a cavity in the wall, maybe 8 inches deep, and inside cavity's a tin box, not a document box, not a safe. A tin box, the old-fashioned kind. Olive green, the size of a shoebox, the kind you used to see at hardware stores or army surplus places. No lock. Just a hinged lid with a small clasp on the front. He didn't touch it. He just stood there looking at it. "I haven't opened it," he said. "I wanted you here when I did." I asked him why. He took a minute before he answered. "Because I think it belonged to your grandfather," he said. "And if I'm right about what's in there, I didn't want to be alone when I found out. My grandfather had died in 1987. I was 11 years old. I remembered him as a tall man with big hands who smelled like pipe tobacco and talked very little. He'd worked the boats for most of his life, then worked at the mill in Bathurst until his back gave out. He died of a heart attack in his sleep, in that house, in the bedroom upstairs that my uncle later used for storage. He was 63 years old. I hadn't thought about my grandfather in years, not seriously. He was a photograph on a wall, a name on a headstone in the cemetery on Rue Tracadie. He was someone who had existed before I was old enough to know him properly. I crouched down and looked at the box without touching it. The metal was cold and slightly damp from being behind the freezer wall for God knows how long. There was a thin skin of rust along the bottom edge, but the rest of it was solid. Someone had put it back there with care. When do you think it went in? I asked. The drywall panel is screwed from the inside, my uncle said. Except it isn't screwed anymore. Whoever put it there must have used screws at first and then taken them out at some point. Either that, or the screws were so old they just gave up. I didn't ask what he meant by that. I understood what he was not quite saying. If the screws were original to whenever that panel went in and they had corroded enough to lose their grip over time, then that box had been sitting behind that wall for a very long time. Possibly decades. I reached in and took it out. It was heavier than I expected. Not dramatically heavy, but heavier than an empty tin would be. Maybe 2 pounds. Maybe a little more. I set it on top of the chest freezer and my uncle stood beside me and we both looked at it for a moment. The clasp was stiff, but it wasn't locked. I worked it back and forth a couple of times until it gave. I opened the lid. The first thing I saw was an envelope, letter-sized, cream-colored, unsealed. And underneath the envelope, folded newspaper clippings, 3 of them, and beneath those, a photograph face down. And beneath the photograph, a small bundle of what looked like receipts or letters, folded together and held with a rubber band so old it had fused to the paper and cracked in 2 places. My uncle made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I took the envelope first. I slid out the paper inside. Single sheet, handwritten in French, in a script I didn't know. My uncle took it from me. He stood reading it for a long time, long enough that I started to worry, long enough that I could hear the freezing rain still coming down above us and the furnace clicking on somewhere behind us. He lowered the paper. "It's from him," he said. "It's from Papa." He handed it back to me. My French isn't as strong as his. I grew up in the city, spent more years in English schools, but I could read enough. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. It wasn't a letter, exactly. It was more like a statement. Or maybe a confession. Something written down because the person who wrote it needed it to be written down somewhere, even if they never intended anyone to read it. My grandfather wrote that in the summer of 1963, before he married my grandmother, he had been involved in something he could not undo. He did not use the word crime. He used the phrase, something that went wrong. He wrote that 2 men were involved, one of whom was still living as of the date the letter was written, and the date at the top of the page was October 1974, which was the year I was born, which was the year my uncle bought this house. He wrote that the other man had been settled with. Those were the words he used, réglé avec, and that this had troubled him every year since. He wrote that he was putting this letter in a safe place not because he intended anyone to find it, but because he could not destroy it either. He said that was his weakness. He signed it with his full name, Réjean Thibodeau, my grandfather's name. I set the letter down on top of the freezer. We stood there for a while in the basement, neither of us saying anything. Outside, the freezing rain had stopped. I could tell because the ticking on the windows above us had gone quiet. My uncle picked up the newspaper clippings next. 2 of them were from the Bathurst Northern Light, 1963 and 1964. Small articles, not front page. A man named, and I'm not going to repeat the name here because that family is still around and they don't need this from a stranger, had gone missing from a fishing camp north of Caraquet in the summer of 1963. His truck was found at the end of a logging road. There was no body. The second clipping, from 6 months later, reported that the search had been called off. The man was presumed dead. Accidental, the RCMP said, no evidence of foul play. The third clipping was from the Tribune in Moncton, 1974. Same name. A small notice, not even a full article, more like an administrative note, stating that this person had been formally declared dead by a provincial court after 11 years at the request of the surviving family. His estate, listed as modest, had been settled and distributed. My uncle read each clipping twice. He held them at arm's length the way he does when he doesn't have his glasses. "I don't know this name," he said. "I don't either," I said. "That doesn't mean Papa didn't." He set the clippings down and we stood there again. I was thinking about my grandfather's hands. Those big quiet hands. I was thinking about the way he used to sit at the kitchen table in the mornings without speaking, just drinking his coffee and looking out the window. I used to think that was just how men from his generation were. I used to think silence was a habit they all had, like bad backs and worn-out boots, and not going to the doctor until something was actually falling off. Now I was thinking maybe the silence had a different reason. I turned the photograph over. It was a black and white photograph, the kind with the white border all the way around and the slightly glossy finish that photographs had in the early 60s. 3 men standing in front of what looked like a fishing boat, somewhere along a dock. The boat's name was too far in the background to read clearly. All 3 men were squinting at the camera against what must have been bright sun. My grandfather was on the left, younger than I ever knew him, maybe 30 years old, slim, wearing a cap pushed back on his head. I recognized him from pictures I'd seen before. He had that same look he always had, even when he was laughing, like part of his attention was somewhere else entirely. The man in the middle I didn't know. The man on the right I did, or rather I knew the face. I'd seen it in the newspaper clippings. My uncle was looking at the photograph now too. "Is that who I think it is?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Then they did know each other," I said. "They did," my uncle said. He put the photograph face down again. "We neither of us touched it after that. We didn't open the bundle of receipts and letters that day. My uncle decided he wanted to sit on it for a while before we went any further. He said he'd spent 71 years not knowing about any of this, and he wasn't going to rush through it now in a cold basement on a February afternoon. He was right. We went back upstairs and I made us fresh coffee and we sat at the kitchen table again, except that now the kitchen felt different. Not wrong, exactly. Just different. The way a room feels different when you understand something about it you didn't understand before. I stayed for 3 hours. We talked about things that had nothing to do with the box. We talked about the weather and about his youngest grandson who was playing bantam hockey in Dieppe and about the new roof he was thinking of putting on the garage in the spring. Normal things. We needed normal things. Before I left, he said to me, "Don't say anything to your mother yet." "I won't," I said. "I need to think about what any of this actually means," he said. "It's possible it means nothing." "It's possible I'm reading this all wrong," I said. We both knew that wasn't likely. On the drive home, the roads were better. The freezing rain had turned to regular rain and then stopped altogether and the temperature was coming up a little. I drove carefully anyway. I had a lot of things to be careful with all of a sudden. I thought about my grandfather and what kind of man he actually was versus the man I thought I knew. I thought about how easy it is to construct a version of someone out of the few pieces they let you see and to mistake that construction for the real thing. My grandfather had been dead for almost 40 years. He couldn't explain himself to me. He couldn't tell me what actually happened on a logging road north of Caraquet in the summer of 1963, or what settled with actually meant in the specific language of what he was and where he came from. He wrote those words in 1974, the year he hid the box in the wall, and he never told a living person that the box was there. Not even his wife, not even his youngest son whose house it was. He took it back from the wall was what I kept coming back to. He removed the screws at some point, or they failed on their own, but the panel came off clean when my uncle pried it, which means either the screws had been gone for years and the panel was just sitting in its frame, or my grandfather came back at some point and removed them himself, as though he had thought about opening the wall again and then decided against it, and then left the panel loose as a kind of compromise with himself. A door he could open but didn't. That bothered me more than anything else in the box, more than the clippings, more than the name I recognized from the newspaper, more than the photograph with those 3 men squinting into the sun. It was the image of my grandfather coming back to that wall with a screwdriver and taking out those screws one by one, and then putting the panel back without the box, except that he hadn't taken out the box. He'd left everything in there. He'd only removed the fasteners. A door he could open, that he kept not opening. For 38 years, from 1974 until the year he died, or however long it was, or longer. My uncle had been in that house since 1974, and he'd never moved the chest freezer until last Tuesday, and the box had been there the whole time. 3 weeks after I came to the house, my uncle called me again. Evening this time. He'd gone through the bundle of receipts and letters on his own. He hadn't wanted to wait anymore, he said, and he wanted to tell me what was in them. Most of it was what you'd expect. Receipts from the early 1960s. Fuel, supplies, a few small payments that might have been wages or might have been something else. 2 letters in French, both short, both from my grandfather to someone whose name my uncle wouldn't tell me over the phone. He said he wanted to be careful about names until he knew more. But there was one more thing in the bundle, a folded piece of paper that wasn't a letter, or it was a page torn from a notebook, and on it, in my grandfather's handwriting, was an address in Tracadie-Sheila. And below the address, a name. Not the name of the missing man. A different name. A woman's name. My uncle had looked up the address. The house was still there. You can find anything on Google Maps now, he said. It's both useful and unsettling. The woman whose name was written on that page would have been in her 80s or 90s by now, assuming she was still alive at all, which my uncle doubted. But names tend to persist in small communities. That's one of the things about the Maritimes that never really changes. And my uncle, after some very careful and quiet asking around through people he trusted, had found out that the woman on that page had a granddaughter who still lived in the area. And the granddaughter, from what he could gather, had no idea that her grandmother's name was written in a tin box hidden behind a wall in a house in Shediac. I don't know what to do with that, he said. What do you mean? I said. I mean, I don't know if that woman needs to know anything, he said. I don't know if what's in that box would give her something or take something away. I don't know what my father was to her grandmother. I don't know if he was someone she'd want to remember or someone she'd rather not. I don't even know for certain that any of this is what it looks like. I understood what he was saying. He was saying that certainty is expensive and sometimes you can't afford it. He was saying that a box full of paper from 60 years ago is not the same as the truth. He was also saying, though he didn't say it out loud, that he was afraid, not of the missing man's name in the newspaper, not of what Règle avec might have meant on a logging road in 1963. He was afraid of the woman's name on that notebook page. He was afraid of what it meant that my grandfather had written it down and kept it. He was afraid that some of what was in that box was grief, and that the grief wasn't only his to feel. We talked for a long time that evening, about my grandfather and what we actually owed him now that he was dead, about whether protecting his memory was the same thing as protecting the truth, or whether those were two different jobs that happened to sometimes overlap, about the granddaughter in Tracadie-Sheila who didn't know any of this existed. I didn't tell my uncle what to do. It wasn't mine to say. The tin box is in my uncle's house still. He moved it out of the basement and put it in the bedroom he uses for storage, on the high shelf in the closet, behind a stack of old tax returns. Not hidden exactly, just put away. He hasn't called the granddaughter in Tracadie-Sheila. Not yet. He told me last month he still thinks about it every day. He said some mornings he wakes up, and the first thing he thinks about is that box, and whether what's inside it is something that should stay closed or whether staying closed is its own kind of wrong. He said he's been reading his father's letter again, the one in French, the one that started with something that went wrong and ended with my grandfather's full name written in a hand that had steadied itself carefully before it put the pen to the paper. He said what bothers him most isn't the part he doesn't understand. It's the part he does. I know what he means. I've been thinking about it too. About how my grandfather painted that house in Shediac before he moved in, before he handed the keys to his youngest son and went back to Bathurst where he lived out the rest of his life. About how he must have stood in that basement some point and put the panel back over the cavity and pushed the chest freezer back in front of it, and then walked up those steep, narrow stairs and out the back door and gotten in his car and driven home and said nothing. About how the house looked the same from the outside the whole time. White clapboard siding, green shutters, the kind of house that looked like it had always been there. It still does.